Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. Many of our listeners probably didn't realize this, but California, home of Hollywood and the film industry, offers tax incentives to film companies in an attempt to lure more film industry jobs to the state. Since 2009, California taxpayers have subsidized Hollywood to the tune of $1 billion. In this episode, Tim and I, PRI's Director of Communications, and I chatted with Michael Thom, Assistant Professor at the Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California. Professor Thom, earlier this year, conducted a study on the impact of these tax credits on creating film jobs. Spoiler alert, he didn't find any evidence that it made a difference. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Next Round, Professor Thom. So I ran across your excellent study titled Time to Yell Cut, which evaluates the impact of the tax credits California provides to the film industry. Many of our listeners would probably be surprised even to know that the state actually provides tax incentives to Hollywood, the film capital of the world. Would you walk us through how this all came about?
So California, like a lot of states, has had a film office for a couple of decades, but it really wasn't until the late 90s, that first decade of the 2000s where tax incentives were the next phase of trying to attract film production. California was somewhat late to the tax incentive game. So it was around 2008, 2009 when the industry and an interest group saw two things happening at the same time. One was that by all accounts, California's motion picture employment had dropped between 2008 and 2009, right along with the recession. Now, at that same time, they also noticed that a number of other states had added tax incentives to their film office efforts. And it wasn't just other states. It was Canadian incentives that existed and were being expanded. Australia was offering incentives. Britain was offering incentives. And they looked at these two factors and said, we're losing jobs. Other places are offering incentives. That must be why we're losing jobs. And they concluded that California should respond in kind with their own tax incentives. And they were successful. The legislature passed a relatively small program that existed mostly untouched until 2014 when the legislature tripled funding. And that program has existed since, and in fact, just this past summer was reauthorized for another 5 years, and that's where we are today.
Professor, since 2009, all total, we've seen that the state's provided more than $1 billion in tax credits to the film industry and really aimed at retaining and increasing jobs in the state. Now, before I worked at PRI, I worked in the legislature for many years, and I worked for our celebrity governor and, USC, I guess he would be professor, I don't know what they call him, Arnold Schwarzenegger. And I remember when the film tax credit was up for reauthorization 2014. I remember all the legislative leaders, they got invited to go to LA and hang out with Warren Beatty celebrating the signing of the tax credit extension. And that's not out of the blue. Legislators love touting, and the Film Commission itself, all the film and TV shows that are coming to the state and all the jobs that are being created thanks to these tax credits. But you've actually done some serious econometric modeling to see if these tax credits really did create jobs, and you found otherwise.
So in order to try and get a handle on this, I looked at 3 different job categories that have some link to the motion picture industry: television production, film production, the support services, and so on. And I exhausted the government's available data, which was from 1991 through 2017. And I used statistical models to try and isolate how much of the change in the people employed in those categories, how much of that change could be traced to not only California's tax incentive, but these competing incentives offered elsewhere, and also to see if it was possible that the motion picture employment simply rose and fell with the labor market in general. And what I ultimately found was that gains and losses in all 3 of those motion picture categories pretty much mimicked the national labor market. So in general, when nationwide employment grew, so did motion picture employment in California. When nationwide employment declined, so did motion picture employment in California. And in fact, that 2008-2009 period is a really good example of that. I also found that California's tax incentive had little to no effect on employment. After controlling for all those other factors, there just wasn't much statistical reason to think that this tax credit had created that many jobs, if at all. That finding, it's pretty important to note, was consistent across about 9 different statistical models. Normally, you'd think at least one of these models would show some kind of substantial positive effects, and I found that was not the case.
So, in addition to evaluating whether jobs were being created because of the tax credits, you also looked at whether the state was actually losing jobs to other states and countries because of their respective tax incentive programs. So what were the results of this part of your study?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because this idea of runaway production, the idea that California was losing jobs because they were running away to other governments that offered incentives, was exactly the case made for the tax incentive in the first place. And in fact, we just heard it this last couple of years ago when they reauthorized and tripled the funding. So what I found was that there really is no good evidence for any runaway production. Other states' tax incentives in multiple models did not have any effect at all on employment in California. In a couple of those models, in fact, the effect was positive, which would suggest that California might have picked up some jobs as a result of these competing incentives, not lost them. But the effects, although they were positive, were still pretty small. I should also note that I looked at the effect of incentives offered by the United Kingdom and found that there was no negative effect on employment in California. And for all of the attention given to Canadian incentives, where a lot of production work does occur, I didn't find any harmful effect in California. It didn't matter if I looked at federal incentives in Canada or the provincial incentives or even combining them all into one. It just did not have a negative effect on employment in California. And again, this was a result that kept coming up over multiple statistical models.
So I read recently in one of the Hollywood trades that the producers of Sneaky Pete, which is a show on Amazon Prime, said that they'll probably get a third season of their show after getting one of these California film tax credits and agreeing to move their production to California. But now, is this really true? I mean, I always thought that audience ratings really determine, and certainly advertising dollars really determine whether a TV show is renewed rather than these taxpayer-funded tax credits.
No, that's exactly right. At the end of the day, the studio or the production business, whatever it is, they need to cover their costs and make a profit. I don't doubt, by the way, that tax incentives might be a factor, but there's a lot of things at play here. I mean, it's the labor pool, it's labor costs, existing regulations, it's the weather, it's the value of currencies. These are what shape where productions decide to go and whether or not they continue. And all of that aside, even if they're responding to tax incentives, that doesn't mean that it is a good investment from the perspective of taxpayers. I mean, if that were the case, then why not just spend $1 trillion on this program?
So if tax credits don't really make a difference in attracting new productions here, what sorts of policies should California be pursuing instead to make us more competitive for more film and TV productions?
That's another good question. So I would fall in line with the academic literature on economic development, which generally is very skeptical that policymakers can outguess the market. So what they should do, I guess, as a matter of policy, is stop trying to pick winners and losers. Time and time again, studies tell us that whether it's state policymakers or local officials that are trying to pick the next big thing, it just does not work out. Again, these incentive programs end up costing far more than they can ever provide in terms of value to taxpayers. And sadly enough, taxpayers would be better off if a lot of times governments just didn't do anything. If they do want to take some kind of proactive steps, they should probably focus on creating a level playing field for all industries, not deeming some industries more worthy than others. Studies tell us what a level playing field looks like. It looks like reasonable labor costs. It looks like light regulation, reasonable taxes. It's often overlooked, but the cost of living matters a lot too. And also the quality of basic public services. None of those things are flashy solutions, but they do tend to work. Fortunately, California fails on most of them.
Has any of your research focused on different communities within California and these tax credits? You know, we had in Sacramento Lady Bird, and even though it was a love letter to Sacramento, the filmmakers said that they weren't able to film it all in Sacramento because of the cost. You could just as easily film a rural scene in the Mojave Desert as you could the middle of Fresno. In sales tax policy, they call it the fiscalization of land use, and all the different communities are fighting over one another for sales tax dollars from car dealerships and strip malls and such. Have you done any research on these tax credits on a even more local level?
No, I have not, but it is certainly, this is a ripe area of additional research because California is pretty good about having employment data that drills down to the county level. What I fear, and there's some indication of this, not just in motion picture incentives, but in other industries as well, is that when states offer some kind of incentive, it does, in a sense, pit different counties or different local governments against each other. And it ends up kind of looking like a zero-sum game, which is some of what you just described. And at the end of the day, if it's a zero-sum game, one county wins, another county loses, but taxpayers are left with the bill, which is why a lot of this picking and choosing winners and losers just doesn't work.
So we can't underestimate the power of the unions in California in pushing the legislature to provide benefits to union-dominated industries. You also write about the looming pension crisis in California, which, again, has largely been driven by generous collective bargaining agreements negotiated by the unions. The Supreme Court's Janus decision will mean that non-union members will no longer have to pay agency fees to the unions. Do you think this will have a long-term impact on California politics?
Well, I'd say it's hard to imagine it not having some kind of impact. But I think with the ink barely being dry on the Janus decision, it's hard to know what that impact will look like. We could look, for example, at other states that have had this right-to-work style opt-out option made available. Wisconsin comes to mind. And if they're any indication, we could probably expect thousands, if not tens of thousands, of union members to opt out of subsidizing their union. And that will ultimately undermine the union's power. But the degree to which that will end up affecting politics, it's too hard to tell. Right now, unions, as you know, are engaged in a lot of legal actions on pension reform. And depending on how those cases go, they may not need to be very powerful in the future. If the California Supreme Court, for example, knocks down some pension reforms, that's a much more lasting decision. So we'll see.
So apart from these film tax incentives that we're talking about today, California and other states for years have also provided tax incentive programs to lure other specific companies and industries and projects to the state with the hope of creating more jobs and businesses here. You know, most recently there was the very famous, really national competition for Amazon's second headquarters. And California put out bids for that and didn't really get very far. Then there was also all the incentives and sweeteners we had to promise the International Olympic Committee to bring the 2028 Olympics here. Not to mention all of the ongoing programs for to try to get clean energy firms and jobs in California. Do you think this approach really worked?
The short answer to your question is no. This gets back to a little bit of what I said earlier, which is that targeting industries or even events, you mentioned the Olympics, this is just not a good approach to economic development. The Amazon bids in California were pretty generous. Elsewhere, they were even more generous and sometimes ostentatious. There was a situation, it was in Tucson, Arizona, where I didn't know if I should laugh or cry, but city officials sent a 21-foot cactus to Amazon executives just to get their attention. A city in Georgia offered to rename the city Amazon if they won this bid. And it almost sounds like something from Hollywood, ironically enough. And yet, here it is, the reality that we're living. What we know from these mega deals is that governments offer so much to land a relatively small number of jobs that could not possibly create the kind of economic growth to generate the taxes to repay all of those costs. And so they come out sort of a net loser. The Olympics, a similar but in many ways different approach of trying to land some event that really only occurs every 4 years. Most cities lose money on this. They lose a lot of money. This is why a lot of cities don't even bother bidding for them anymore. There are a couple of exceptions, though. Los Angeles and their 1984 bid is one of them. Hopefully, the next Summer Olympics, history repeats itself.
So California was once a bellwether state with the old saying, so goes California, so goes a nation. But the rest of the country doesn't necessarily believe that that's the case anymore and see the state as dominated by extreme left politics. You're a public policy professor at USC, which, by the way, is our alma mater. What do you think is the state of politics in California? And more important, is it hampering our ability to make headway on such important issues as the housing crisis and homelessness and poverty?
Well, I'd say you probably hit the nail on the head. The state of California politics, at least as far as I could see, having lived here just a little over 6 years, is that it is a pretty much governed as a one-party state, and it kind of shows. Essentially, every problem that is faced, certainly in the legislature in a number of cities, certainly the larger cities, San Francisco and Los Angeles, they're kind of tackled from a leftist political perspective. So all of the solutions tend to look the same. It's a revolving door of taxes and fees and regulations and subsidies. And when that doesn't work, they go back to the drawing board and come back and give us another system of taxes, fees, regulations, and subsidies. If that doesn't work, then we get a third round and a fourth round. And the cumulative effect, as we know, living in California, is that we have a state with a very high income tax, among the highest in the country, among the most progressive in the country as well. We have pretty high sales taxes. We have an extremely high cost of living. And no one in Sacramento seems very concerned with any new ideas. It's just the same mix of taxes, fees, regulations, and subsidies. I don't see that changing until enough voters show up and send a message that it's time for a different approach.
So finally, for our last question, it's always our tradition here on our Next Round podcast to ask each guest for their favorite adult or otherwise beverage recommendation. PRI, so close to wine country, we love nothing more than having an adult beverage and discussing public policies. What is your favorite drink of choice to fuel your creative research on these sorts of issues after a long day of being in the classroom?
I would say, actually, it's not an adult beverage at all. It's a very boring, plain, yet delicious Diet Coke.
Thanks very much, Professor Thom.
Thank you.
Thanks to our guest, Professor Michael Thom, and to my colleague, Tim Anaya. To read more of Michael Thom's work, go to his page at the USC's Price School of Public Policy website. And please save the date. Our Sir Anthony Fisher Gala in San Francisco takes place on Saturday, November 10th. Our keynote speaker is none other than author and media commentator Mark Stein. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/Pacific Research 1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. We hope you'll come back again for Next Round with PRI.